Hey everyone, thanks for coming out. And I always say that. And behind me is the FARC, this guy who was killed. This is the FARC's office. Basically, the country was in civil war. So that's what we're going to talk a little about today is Calibas and the cleavages of civil war. Now, what I really like about this article about ontology of political violence is he takes it, it's not like necessarily ontologically speaking, like questioning reality to such a degree, what's a terrorist, what's not a terrorist, but it does fit in that line. What Kalibas, he's a little more positivist, if you understand the difference between interpretive methods and positivism, not that important for here. But ontology stresses, as you know, the extent to which reality is reality. Like the person behind me is Manuel from the FARC, that is the guerrilla fighters from Colombia, terrorists, horrible human beings, protecting the peasantry, fighting for land reform, etc. But Calibas even does a little more of a twist to it than that, which I really, really like. He's from Greece and he's very incredulous about general cleavages in explaining political violence. Let's say terrorism versus non-terrorism, Cold War, East versus West, etc. And we're going to apply this to the movie, is that he talks about there's a lot of these on the ground reasons for political violence. To be more specific, this is a guy that talks about, if you really read the article, I love that sentence in the abstract where he basically says actions on the ground. Of course, I'm reading this, I can't remember anything. Often turn out to be related to local and private conflicts rather than the war's driving or master cleavage, meaning how we kind of see it, say, from the United States or another powerful country, what's going on locally. And what I really like what he's talking about is he's saying there is more that we do not understand. So he punctiliously, yes, punctiliously, I've been waiting a long time to use that word. That means really focuses on the nitty gritty of what's going on. So let's say, for example, two people start fighting, right? For whatever reason, there are two groups. The United States would say, oh, wow, one's communist, non-communist, one's with us, one's against us, one's with Russia, one's with the Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. But there are many local reasons for these kinds of acts of political violence. So in one case, I think he talks about, it's about cattle. People are fighting over cattle in different areas of land and things like that, that it's more personal and private than we think. And when we get into the movie on Salvador, well, El Salvador, the movie's called El Salvador, we are going to start looking at it. Is this really about communism, not communism, anti-communism, or are people being pushed into these different wars, right, and conflicts for different reasons? And that's the thing I think is so interesting about this, about political violence, the lamentable situation. But like, you look at the FARC civil war, it's not just about communism, it's about land rights, it's about cattle rights, it's about how the United States supported some pretty brutal dictators that then really brutalized the peasantry, etc. So what Kalibas does in this article, and he's from Greece, so I think what's interesting, he's a kind of a I know Greece is the West, but Western in the sense of from the United States or UK, from a more powerful nation. So I think he has a real soft spot for understanding. So it's that local context. And that's what we're going to see in the movie. Like, were people fighting against the government in El Salvador because they were communists, or were they fighting against the government because they were essentially, being pushed into the FMLN, that's the guerrilla fighters, because the United States was supporting these horrible death squads, right? So when you look at something I know a lot about, Nicaragua, sorry, I always bring things back to Nicaragua, were people fighting against Somoza and becoming Sandinista because they were communists, like Ronald Reagan wanted to say, that was back in the 80s, or because Somoza, who was supporting the brutal dynasty, the dictatorship, was, stealing people's land, money. He was literally stealing children's blood when the Red Cross was going in, and suppose that was supposed to be for people who were sick, but Somoza was actually stealing it and selling it on the market. He stole a lot of money from the 1972 earthquake. So you start looking at more local issues that a lot of people don't understand. Now the question is, why don't a lot of people understand these local issues? It's not about, say, terrorism, non-terrorism, East versus West, good versus bad. Because a lot of people don't really get into the nitty-gritty of area studies. And this is one of the reasons why I think we know very little about countries, even though sometimes we write about them, is that we want to apply our theory. We want to, use this country to kind of better your careers, you publish, etc. But you don't know really much of what's going on. And policymakers don't know much of what's going on either. They just see things in simple black and white, good versus bad, etc. So issues, I think, what Kalibas is coming to, they're a lot more complex, and they take a certain local, let me be perfectly clear, local and private and personal issues, right? They're not just fighting because, I'm a terrorist, I'm with Al Qaeda, I'm with ISIS. And you even see that with ISIS. Why did the ranks of ISIS swell? It wasn't just because people had an affinity for ISIS. The problem is that when the Shias took power after Saddam Hussein Sunni had power for so long, there was what we call Shia revenge. And then people, particularly Sunni, said, if I don't join another group that's bigger, right, I'm going to get killed. So ISIS, actually, their ranks started swelling. And the same thing goes in El Salvador. There was some great literature on it that people weren't joining the FMLN, that's the guerrilla group in El Salvador, because they were communists. They had no other choice but to basically join the guerrilla group in order to have protection. You see the same phenomena in inner cities. A lot of people, particularly very conservative, people say, you shouldn't have been in a gang. Now you're in prison. You got what you deserve. But a lot of people didn't want to be in gangs in the inner city throughout the United States. I'm referring to the United States now. But they felt like they had no choice. So every day they would go to school and get beaten up. And the only way to stop getting beaten up is to join a gang. So there's more of a local context there that we have to understand. I think Kalivas, if you really read this article, really, hits the nail on the head, to use a colloquial term, on trying to understand those local issues, which would make just a great research paper or something like that. Because what do we really know about what's going on in, say, Eritrea or Ethiopia? We are going to do some stuff on Ethiopia and Eritrea, but I can't pretend that I'm an expert and I know all the local issues of what's driving political violence. And I want to stress one thing at the end of this little lecture, is that he talks about cleavages. Cleavages are what breaks, that kind of separates people and like kind of causes them to have violence. Like, certain cleavages, like people see ethnic, maybe ideological, etc. These different things, phenomena that separate people and cause them to create acts of political violences. But that's what he's saying, is that these cleavages aren't necessarily always what we think, that they're very contextual issues here. You have to understand the context and the local issues of the fighting. And sometimes the United States, Russia, whatever, kind of just says, no, this is about, the Ukraine versus Russia or something like that, or like East versus West, terrorism versus non-terrorism, Iran versus Saudi Arabia. The Houthis get kind of caught up in it. Oh, that's all, because of Iran. But if you start looking at the local context of the issues in Yemen, I know I kind of jump around a lot, but it is interesting when you start looking at the local context of a lot of these conflicts, like Yemen. The Houthis were exploited for years. They were in areas with very little water until enough is enough, and they started fighting, and they actually were able to overthrow the government. But we have to start looking at these local issues of conflict, opposed to kind of imposing our own ideas of conflict. And I think Kalibas, in this article, one of my favorite articles, really gets to that. So thanks for listening, everyone. And please reach out either individually through email or in community forum. Take care, everyone.